Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us for the last of the core events of the Architecture Fringe 2021. My name is Scott Macaulay. I'm one of the co-producers of the Fringe, and outside that, I'm a climate literacy educator, climate justice activist, and I kind of deal lots in kind of climate crisis activism as well. And pass to Matt as well.
Hi everyone, have a good morning. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Matt. I'm part 2 architectural assistant and the co-producer with the Architecture Fringe. It's lovely to have you here today to hear our amazing provocateurs, and I'll pass it to Scott to explain to you what's happening today.
Right, fantastic. So today's event is a little bit different, as has the whole theme been, and this is going to be a provocation-powered world cafe. So we're going to hear from some fantastic provocations from really inspiring collectives. So we're going to hear from Decolonized Architecture, Enough, the New European Bauhaus, and After the Pandemic. And because, as we know, the reality of the climate crisis is intersectional. It is not just about carbon emissions and targets that are essentially empty promises. It's about real impacts on people's lives. But people around the world have been feeling this for decades. This is not something that has hit us out of the blue. This is not something that's only been an issue for a few years. This has been over half a century. So what we're going to have today is we're going to have provocations, and then you're going to get some space to discuss. So you're going to get put into breakout rooms to discuss these. And for the entire event, we've got some boards set up on Miro, so you can take part, say where you're from, you can build upon discussions, you can leave contact details to meet other people later, and we can just go from there. So, my brain's gone blank.
No worries.
Yeah, this is entirely new for me. I'm in a situation I've never been in before. So yeah, so this is the whole way the event's going to work. We're going to have provocation, discussion, and before we begin as well, you're going to get some quick fire introductions to make it a little bit less formal. And yeah, so pass to Matt so you can
basically
take it away.
We would like you to populate the Miro boards with information and feedback and comments for our today's provocateurs and their talks. And basically we would like to use Miro basically to keep your thoughts and have a live resource for future reference and developing the Fringe further. We have some amazing volunteers creating these Miro boards this year. We had Bex Brown, Teodora Ratcheva and Kasia Bonenberg, and I will pass to Bex Brown to give you a quick, to make a quick demonstration on the Miro boards.
Hi, thank you. I'll just share my screen. Yeah, so here's our Miro board. There's 4 sections to it, and it's all quite easy to use. So some information, and then here's some space for the discussions. There's lots of post-it notes here set up, which you can just click on and drag to somewhere, and then double click to start typing. And then here we have our guest book, where you can add a pin to show where you are joining us from today just by clicking and dragging. Then for to leave your contact details for further collaborations, we've set up some speech bubbles here, which you can just click and drag, and then again double click to type. And you're also welcome to add a picture if you like. Just from here, there's an arrangement of tools that you can play with. And then lastly, here there's some space for reflections, again with the post-it notes, which work as click and drag. And you can also add text here. There's these different tools to use. But the post-it notes seem to work quite well. Okay, hope that makes sense.
That's great. Yeah, thank you, Bex. And yeah, the link for the Miro board is going to be in the chat. So we are now going to introduce you our first speaker for today, Decolonized Architecture. They are a collective of students and alumni of the University of Bath formed to tackle institutional racism within architecture and its education. Collaborating with staff across their university, they are catalyzing an inclusive transformation in its education, drawing out experiences and exploring the address of systemic bias. So we have Harsha Gori and Mohit Bats. They are both graduated from University of Bath with a bachelor degree in architecture in 2020. Harsha, since then, has been working in Pune in India as an environmental design assistant, and she is a certified passive house consultant. While Mohit has been working as a part-time architectural assistant at Glasgow Nichols Architects in Birmingham. And we also have some additional members from their team, Jasmine and Tanya, who just jumped in, and they will contribute to today's discussion.
Hi, thank you for having us. My name is Marsha, and today us as a team from Decolonized Architecture, we're going to be speaking about some of the research we've done on intersectional environmentalism and how it relates to post-colonial identities and decolonization as a process. So just a little bit about us. The group started in July 2020, formed as a solution-driven group following the Black Lives Matter movement globally. We aim to engage with students and staff and visiting faculty at Bath to bring change regarding the Eurocentric rigidity of architectural education. So launched primarily to operate within the architectural and civil engineering department at Bath, due to complete support, we have been able to widen our efforts across the larger Bath institution, as well as having reached universities across the UK and Europe. We've decided to focus our aims on the 3 pillars of architectural education. This is the design studio, the history and theory module, and the architectural thesis. So to decolonize is to examine the structures which exist within institutions and to challenge the perspectives passed down from those in power, which usually favor the status quo. This is evident in the Eurocentric perspective of the history curriculum across architectural education, and the consequent subconscious bias for Western design styles that it's seen in graduates. So how does decolonization relate to climate change, and how does it affect climate change? So developed nations typically have high carbon dioxide emissions per capita with a low growth rate of these emissions. And while meanwhile, many developing countries have a lower emission rate per capita, we have to remember that this is often due to very large populations in these countries. And actually, the net growth rate of emissions is substantially higher. So these kind of uneven contributions to the climate crisis are at the core of the challenges that the world community faces in finding effective and equitable solutions to global warming. So architecture can be explored in its description as a form of narrative, as a form of political tools, or as technology, or as building practice. There is need to promote diverse and multifaceted platforms of building practice to combat the challenges of today's climate emergency. Since DA started, people from around the world have reached out to us and pointed out that despite living in Asia, in South America, etc., a large focus of their architectural education has been on European and North American architects. This has been in part due to the implicit bias that the architectural world today still has towards Western styles, and is a result of colonization. So colonization, in turn, is a direct result of Western imperialism born from the ideals of the 17th century, which centered whiteness as the default and the natural form of humanity. This very rigid narrative was enforced globally with no regard to cultural and environmental context. And as a political tool, architecture explores these accelerated carbon emissions caused as a byproduct of forced migration, colonial technological practices, and hyperurbanization. So what was once physical invasions in the time of empires, today actually manifests itself much more subtly in the implicit bias that the architectural world has developed and maintains towards Western ideals and figureheads. The subconscious adaptation of success or urban progress has been observed in cities undergoing rapid urbanization. So as an example, let's look at Jakarta. Jakarta has been combating a harsh subsidence and is today actually the fastest sinking city in the world. As Jakarta has rapidly grown, the nature of its land usage has changed. So where once there were low density housing and commercial districts, medium to high density developments have replaced them with high-rise office buildings, hotels, shopping malls, apartment complexes, and these developments draw vast quantities of water every single day from deep wells drilled about 100, 200 meters below the surface. This rapid urbanization has placed stress on the city's limited groundwater resources, reducing the height of the groundwater table and drying out the deep layers of soil, leaving them vulnerable to collapse and compaction. This, in turn, has made the upper layers sink, and combined with the sheer weight of such developments, has been the main cause of subsidence. The unfortunate representation of the typical American skyscraper as a benchmark and symbol of metropolitan progress has led us to forget the fact that success might not look the same or take the same form all across the world. The world's metropoles are inevitable, but it would seem odd that they appear so similar despite climatic, social, and cultural differences. Therefore, it's important to explore architecture as technology, in addition to architecture as political narrative approaches to building practice. Architecture as technology involves practices such as using natural forms and materials and actively calculating carbon emissions and designing with energy conservation in mind. Now, these practices often manifest in passive house building techniques or bioengineering, technological systems that rely on engineering problem solving. Over to you, Mohit.
Thank you very much, Harsha. Hi, everyone. My name is Mohit. So I'm going to talk about why must we decolonize education. So what are the effects of these blanket building techniques, which are usually European or North American, on the rest of the world? A lot of students today, their access to precedents because of this implicit like red line boundary along a certain geographic region of the world means that they are not as well equipped to design for the needs of the rest of the world. And by perpetuating this, we risk being able to design sustainable schemes for environments around the world that ask completely different questions. A good example of this is the Albar Towers in Abu Dhabi. Now, these are a set of twin towers, and they look absolutely amazing with this kinetic facade that opens and closes at different points in the day, creating this, this animated lattice across the facade. And it's a great example of innovation in architecture. And this scheme was inspired by the traditional mashrabia, which was a screen that was used for the same purposes, to control, solar gains and to control the amount of natural light, but also in those times to provide privacy. But the question that this scheme raises is simple. Why are we designing buildings with a completely glass facade behind it in the first place in the desert, and that is where there is a bit of a disconnect. If architecture and design, if its first response should be, responding to its site and what are its immediate constraints, then how can we justify building very similar buildings in wildly different environments? We can almost look at this as a sort of hierarchy for responses to sustainable designs. First, we work with our macro, the site constraints that we have, which might be the wind, the amount of sun, or the temperatures in a certain place. And that would affect things like how your aperture sizing, how big your windows are, the thickness of walls if you want to optimize thermal mass in your scheme. And then we look at the mechanical and electrical, which is the M&E, and we can use that to fine-tune the performance of a building. So we see a lot of buildings in these extreme environments, and they often get the label of they are extremely sustainable. But however, if we're designing these buildings with, in this case, glass facades, then having a very powerful air conditioning system, for example, may not be the best or should not be the first port of call when we're thinking of responses to such natural environments. So part of the issue arising from colonialism is this vision of modernity. A key driving factor for developing nations and countries such as the United Arab Emirates is desire to become contemporary, and this too often is mixed with in correlation with Western ideals. And Abu Dhabi's neighbor, Dubai, is a paragon of this. It currently ranks as 4th in the world for cities with the greatest number of skyscrapers at 215 buildings over 150 meters tall, and that's just after New York with 297. A key difference between these two cities, however, is their climate zones, which have seemingly been disregarded when it comes to development in the Middle East. Another example could be Hong Kong, which is located within a subtropical climate zone, and yet it is ranked as having the most number of skyscrapers than any city in the world, with 482 buildings over 150 meters. These, all these reflective surfaces, the tall structures and hyper-urbanization all contribute to what we call the urban heat island effect, and which drives up the soaring temperatures within the city. And in fact, I think July 2020 was recorded as Hong Kong's hottest month, and residents had been told to expect highs of 40 degrees in that summer.
So without leaving behind the necessity of urbanism, how do we really learn from the vernacular? So as an example, in the more rural areas of China, yodong dwellings are traditionally carved into the hillside to make use of the cooling properties of thermal mass that the earth provides. Over time, these have evolved into masonry dwellings, which usually share at least one face with the hillside. But due to urbanization occurring within these rural areas, many people now wish to live within more contemporary housing and have begun building using concrete construction. This, of course, has a much greater environmental impact, but it also reduces the area available for farming and disrupts the natural ecosystem. The winner of the 2006 World Habitat Awards, the revisited yodong dwellings, are over 1,000 sustainable dwellings built in the Loess Plateau in China, inspired by the traditional vernacular. So this self-build project encourages awareness of land and environment conservation, while the traditional skills of yodong construction techniques have been preserved and are thankfully passed down to lower generations. This new housing design is based on the traditional design, but increases the classic one-story yodong to 2 stories and includes a sun space at the front and earth-sheltered roofs, which serve to increase local indoor daylight levels as well as improving natural ventilation. What they also do is use the local topography, which reduces the materials used in construction, while all the other materials are actually sourced locally.
So when we look at vernacular building techniques, there's too often it's almost viewed through like these misty eyes, and there's a sense of nostalgia that comes with them, that look what our culture or our heritage used to be. These, it might be ornate carvings, etc. However, these vernacular building techniques are some of the most sustainable in the world, because at the time of their origin, due to the lack of fast transport or the internet or material discoveries, people were literally limited by what they had around them. And it's almost like an essay in working with what you have and optimizing your construction to your surroundings. Now, obviously, it would be naive to say that mud huts are the solution to our issues today, and that it is such, and construction and similar construction would solve all of humanity's needs, because at the end of the day, we have to accept that our needs have grown since the inception of different vernacular building techniques, and all of these need to be accommodated. So the key takeaway is that we need to adapt and not replicate. There is nothing to say that these construction techniques or the ideologies cannot be adapted to suit today's needs. Architecture has reached, at the end of the day, to the point where it is today due to advances and evolution in technology. But what we need to do is, as well as teaching the students the history and of vernacular construction, but then also supplement this by teaching them the practical interpretations of the same. So at Decolonized Architecture, one of our key flagship projects is what we call Technology Tuesday, where we take an example of such construction and then we draw a quick section or a working detail of it, just to explain how such a construction technique worked. So if we start with, for example, the most idealistic, if we will, these Malkaf wind catchers from Egypt. Now, these are extremely good. Basically, they would draw in wind from these wind catchers and funnel them down into the building, and the cool air would heat up and carry the heat, and then rise up and then exit the building through flues in the roof, etc. However, then if we look at this implement this today, and it might throw up some problems as how much actual control do the users have over their environment. Do we need to take pests into account? Do you want birds flying in? Or it would throw up some natural challenges. However, it is a good place to start. Another example is the living root bridges in the state of Meghalaya in India. Now, these were the ficus elastica tree. Their roots would be manipulated, twisted, stretched over the span of, I think, 15 odd years, and they would and these bridges are living as much as every bit as living as the tree, and they are structurally sound, and they are still in use today in different parts. But then this would also throw up the questions of, is that really practical? Do you want a bridge that takes 15 years to build? It may not be the easiest or the most accessible to cross, and so those are the kind of things that we have to look at. But then, as mentioned, these are the almost like the lowest common denominator. So contemporary interpretations would fall under the examples such as the floating structures, Makoko floating structures by the firm called NLE. Now, Makoko is an informal floating settlement in Nigeria, and the initial project for that community was a school, which was designed as this, this triangular prism floating alongside the community to serve their education needs, and it was equipped with solar panels and then louvers for shading, etc. Unfortunately, the first iteration was destroyed in a storm. However, then this was reinvented, rethought, and used in another floating scenario within China. And this is kind of what we're getting at, is that it is an iterative process. Looking at the history will not solve problems straight away. However, it is having this willingness, this openness to explore these ideas as opposed to resorting to the cheapest or the fastest modes of construction. Another example of this is the dugong brackets from China. These were used in the 700s BC. And basically what these are a set of interlocking brackets, almost like an inverted pyramid. And the central diagram, it shows the load transfer, where you have the multiple brackets at the top, and then that would filter down and the load would be transferred down into the ground. Now, these did not use any nails, any glue, any sort of fixative. However, these structures are still standing today, and they are some of the most earthquake-resistant structures in the world. So it is drawing from these kind of principles and seeing how can these be used in our solutions to today's needs, as opposed to, as we mentioned, resorting to construction techniques that are used in in other parts of the world.
So where does this actually leave us? It may seem that the current need for addressing the climate emergency creates this trade-off between achieving the typical dense, accommodative metropolis and the pared-back construction of our ancestors. However, this does not necessarily have to be the case, because the nature of these fundamentals is that they will always remain constant. The research and justification for these experimental collaborative building techniques does exist, but there needs to be a need and an urge to incorporate these into the mainstream to a much greater extent. However, this has to be by acknowledging that when it comes to architecture, of course, one size doesn't fit all. And as young designers, it comes as our responsibility to promote and practice these collaborative architectural styles. Their necessity in tackling the climate emergency, as well as promoting a larger demographic of architectural techniques, would inspire greater versatility in urban environments. And today we are in a world where many of us are slowly reclaiming our identities, and the same should apply to architecture. Hong Kong need not look like New York, and Dubai need not look like London, but by acknowledging local strengths and what the immediate surroundings have to offer, not only would we be able to harness our identities faster, our built environment would be much more suited to its real-world demands. And that is all from all of us at Decolonized Architecture. Thank you for listening.
Thank you for the great presentation, and we'll go to Scott now.
Yeah, that was absolutely fantastic. Thanks for giving us a really great oversight. As we the really insightful and really powerful point you did bring up is that we have this dislocation from nature that has been perpetuated and taught as the absolute norm in architectural responses, especially in sustainability. So what we're going to do now is we're going to have our first discussion. So we're going to bear in mind what we've just learned, what we've just been told, and we're going to discuss and reimagine the forms and materials that we'll use in the future of architecture. So if we are going to embrace the vernacular, if we're going to learn from where we live, we're going to respond to context, not just aesthetically, but we're going to look from micro, macro climates, planetary systems. How is our built environment going to change? Is it going to change what we're building with? How are we going to reimagine how we look at the built environment? So we're going to mostly talk about forms, materials, and anything else you want to bring to the conversation. So everything that comes up is the best thing that can come up. And we're going to put you in breakout rooms for about 10-15 minutes. So just introduce yourselves again and have as rich a conversation as you possibly can. So thank you very much for the first provocation, and I look forward to the rest of them as well. That was a fantastic beginning. So thank you all very, very much. Welcome back, everyone. We're just going to take, just to keep things to time as well, we're going to try and hurry up just very slightly on these things. But just before we do, I'd like to invite our speakers and the committee from Decolonized Architecture. Is there anything you didn't have the opportunity to share that you would like to at this point? So was there something that you weren't able to fit into your presentation, or something that people didn't ask the right question for? So just if you all have this one thing, we can do a quick go around. What is one thing you'd all four of you would like to throw into the mix before we move on to our next provocation?
I'll go first. I think not so much what we weren't able to bring up, but one of the things that was mentioned in our breakout room was that looking at the urban fabric as viewing it as a blanket as opposed to dots around a map, and there's the pandemic has possibly accelerated the need or the appreciation for everyone not being clustered up into one place and spreading out a lot more as we go forward.
Fantastic. So who'd like to jump in next?
So yeah, again, something which came up in my breakout room, which I thought was really interesting, was questioning whether buildings which are more durable and last longer are more sustainable than buildings which I guess are designed for the short term, but then could be adaptable. Because we felt that a lot of the materials used in the construction industry currently with steel and concrete frames are designed because they will last, you know, kind of stand up to the end of time. But then if they're no longer applicable or serving their purpose after 100 years, then it would have been better to design something which wouldn't necessarily last that long, you know, perhaps kind of 50 years, like half the span, but then actually could be deconstructed or even repurposed.
I can go next. Kind of going off of what I think Andy mentioned in the chat, we talked about how much of it, in terms of these links to kind of Western precedents being duplicated, how much of it is tied into world finance, and overall to what extent is kind of like how a lot of the projects, the new build projects, are a small amount of the city that's currently pre-existing, and to what extent are buildings actually kind of net zero carbon, and how willing are developers and kind of the council to challenge that and looking to whether they're making a real like positive impact rather than kind of selling them off as net zero carbon for profit. So that was kind of an additional point we discussed.
Yeah, I would agree with the other three that most of our conversation as well was on how to kind of broaden our lens as to what we consider a building material or a construction technique. And it's unfortunately not something that just lies in the hands of architects. It's a big team of people, a big team of contributors to a building project. And it is a long but kind of necessary journey to making sure that everyone's got a say and everything plays an equal part in the kind of construction process as well.
So our next speaker is Mike Small from Enough. Enough are a Scottish collective whose members are connected to different forms of activism and social change, setting out to develop project ideas in response to the frames of degrowth and decolonization. Through various strands of work, they seek to strategically build relationships with and between those explicitly challenging and exploring alternatives to capitalism, with a parallel focus on issues of equity and oppression under the prism of environmental focus. By doing so, they seek to urgently communicate and demonstrate unignorably visible and interconnected and intersectional nature of the challenges we face today. Mike Small, which is here today with us, is a member of the Enough Collective. He is a freelance writer, journalist, author, and publisher with an interest to degrowth, venture communism, and social ecology. He's an editor at Bella Caledonia since 2007 and Less, a journal on degrowth, radical sufficiency, and decolonization in Scotland. And he's currently working on a biography of Patrick Gates in history of Scotland from 1950 to 2020. So I want to welcome him and thank you for being with us today. Hope you're well.
Hi, thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me. And it's very interesting to interact with your ideas and your amazing program that you've produced. I'm going to say something a little bit about my background and a little bit about Enough, and then I'm going to shut off my camera and read you something that I wrote about a year ago. So my background is as a social ecologist and as a venture communist. I studied under Murray Bookchin, the great anarchist thinker in Vermont in the 1990s. And I've been working on ideas around climate change and social transformation in Scotland since then. I'm the editor of Bella Caledonia, which is an online magazine that looks at the idea of self-determination and what that means beyond constitutional change. And I'm also the editor, or one of the editors, of Less, a journal of degrowth in Scotland, and I'll share those links with you. Enough is a collective of people that works in Scotland. It's a belief, a response, and a call to action. We believe that inequality, oppression, injustice, power and climate breakdown are all connected to the same story, that the economy must keep growing no matter what the cost. And we believe that our economy is destroying our society. We're consuming resources faster than they can be replenished, and we're pushing our planet's capacity to its limit. So we're interested in the concept of degrowth and decolonization as a critique, but also what is the opposite of decolonization. So if colonization is the thing that is essentially driving extractivism and planetary destruction, then what is the opposite of that? And we think that that is re-inhabitation and relocalization of society and the economy. To change everything, we need to change anything, we need to change everything, and we need to do it now. We've had enough of living lives where we're told should be making us happy, but instead make us feel precarious, more overworked and more stressed than ever. We've had enough of feeling alone, of feeling the constant struggle, no matter how hard we work or how much we have. We've woken up to the fact that one person's poverty, another person's overwork, and more extreme weather are all connected, because we understand that our economic system and climate crisis are fundamentally linked. So I'm going to try and read to you a piece that I wrote last week, which is about degrowth and our post-COVID future. So I'm going to put my screen off so you can't see my ugly mug, and hope you can listen to this, and then we'll have some discussion. The Indian author Arundhati Roy wrote, "Our minds are still racing back and forth, longing for a return to normality, trying to stitch our future to our past and refusing to acknowledge the rupture. But the rupture exists, and in the midst of this terrible despair, it offers us a chance to rethink the doomsday machine we have built for ourselves. Nothing could be worse than a return to normality." When we at the NUF launched the Degrowth Commission almost a year ago, we knew we'd meet some resistance. The idea of growth is so hardwired into our brains, it's seen as an essential good. Growth is everything. Growth is deeply associated with progress, both social and personal. Growth is assumed to be the thing that shares wealth. Growth is life. How can growth be bad? We said that growing our economy is costing us our future. We were ridiculed, but mostly ignored. The task of dragging the world into the reality that only degrowing our economy was compatible with a viable future seemed a long-term and difficult political and cultural project. Now, overnight, it's our collective reality. Boeing has shut down. Nobody's buying anything they don't need. The lockdown, which has seen 3 billion people under some form of restriction, has grounded flights, emptied buses and trains. The streets and shops are empty. The coronavirus has the impact to reduce China's CO2 emissions by a quarter. The impact is laid out by Laura Milaverta, an analyst at Centre for Research on Energy and Clean Air, covering air quality and energy trends in China. Suddenly, we've been thrown into the future we imagined was impossible to achieve. We are so far off the map that political realities are being remade. Our collective sat-nav has shut down. Of course, it is horrific and nothing to celebrate, but it is uncovering so much about our society and our economy. The first uncovering is social, not ecological. As Rebecca Solnit writes, the first lesson a disaster teaches us is that everything is connected. The shared experience of a common global phenomenon is creating fear, anxiety, and panic. But it's also manifesting residual and latent forms of mutualism and community, solidarity and collectivism that we thought had been completely extinguished under late capitalism. While state action and coordination is essential, what we're also seeing is a parallel growth of decentralized neighborhood action. Freedom lists the COVID-19 mutual aid groups in the UK. It's important to recognize that these ways of operating have their roots in anarchist forms of organisation. As Peter Kropotkin wrote in Mutual Aid, A Factor in Evolution, the mutual aid tendency in man has so remote an origin and is so deeply interwoven with all the past evolution of the human race that it has been maintained by mankind up to the present time, notwithstanding all the vicissitudes of history. It was chiefly evolved during periods of peace and prosperity, but even when the greatest calamities befell men, when whole countries were laid waste by wars and whole populations were decimated by misery or groaned under the yoke of tyranny, the same tendency continued to live in the villages and among the poorer classes in the towns. It still kept them together, and in the long run, it reacted even upon those ruling, fighting, and devastating minorities, which dismissed it as sentimental nonsense. While the virus presents opportunity for the most repressive regimes and reactionary tendencies, it also presents unique opportunities for reimagining our economy. This isn't easy in a world where people are more concerned that Wimbledon was cancelled than COP26. It's also not easy when these restrictions have been imposed rather than created, and in a society where every outlet of the media yearns for a return to normal and the recommencement of moron culture, bullshit jobs, and dead ideas. What has the virus revealed? That GDP is a measurement, and endless consumerism and hypercapitalism are destroying not just our planet, but our experience of life. The fragility and precarity of the economy we have endured has been laid out open to us. As the economist Jason Hickel notes, COVID-19 has revealed that key parts of our economies will need to be relocalized as much as possible and removed from just-in-time corporate supply chains, including medical equipment and basic food supplies. There is a bitter irony to the fact we have all been convinced to use the word growth to describe what is ultimately a process of depletion and breakdown. The extent to which the growth economy has and must undermine the basis of our environment through resource exploitation and extractivism was well known. But what was perhaps less understood generally was the extent to which the gig economy and the systems of consumption have depleted our whole society. Suddenly the task seems to be doing everything that should have been done anyway. From creating the relocalized, resilient circular economy we only talked about, to ditching the measurements of GDP we only pretended to take seriously, to reclaiming our food system to being fit for purpose, to creating a universal basic income, to understanding our transport and travel culture, to understanding how to use the tools of digital technology in our interests, reimagining what productivity actually is, and to understand differently our relationship between generations and what education is and for. There are glimpses that some of this might be beginning to happen. At a deeper level, questioning growth is also a matter of questioning progress, and this may be a more difficult but a more worthwhile learning from the COVID crisis. This is so profound we are only at the cusp of understanding it, and there are immediate positive outcomes from this shared experience. In the midst of lockdown, we are learning that profound positive change is possible. In the midst of domestic isolation, we are relearning the need for community and collectivism. In the midst of social distancing, we are relearning the need for sociability and appreciating our need for nature. But their dangers are obvious too. As those studying the ecological economic phenomena in China have observed, overall, the figures reinforce my estimate that China's carbon emissions fell by around 25% over a 4-week period as outlined, equivalent to around 200 million tons of CO2. Demand slowly returned to normal levels over an extended 7-week period, bringing the reduction so far to around 25 million tons of CO2 equivalent, with emissions some 18% lower than usual levels. The demand to return to normal and to decimate all of the ecological, social and cultural gains will be overwhelming. We will be complicit in this return unless we articulate a response. The dark tragedy is this. We have been catapulted to the future we demanded, and are presented with vast opportunity to create a radically different and ecologically viable economy. But all of the forces in society that benefited from the pre-COVID world are working for a fast return to radical unsustainability and uncertainty. Elite forces want us to return as soon as possible to a world hurtling towards climate disaster, extreme inequality and hierarchy, pointless and useless work and endless growth. Capital wants us to return as quickly as possible to constant consumption and mindless economic activity. A return to a growth economy and the numbing comforts of hyper-consumerism would be the worst possible outcome. As Arundhati Roy writes again, our minds are still racing back and forth, longing for a return to normality. Historically, pandemics have forced humans to break with the past and imagine their world anew. This one is no different. It is a portal, a gateway between one world and the next. We can choose to walk through it, dragging the carcasses of our prejudice and hatred, our avarice, our data banks and dead ideas, our dead rivers and smoky skies behind us. Or we can walk through lightly with little luggage, ready to imagine another world and ready to fight for it. Roy is right to see the pandemic as a portal, but if we aren't careful, the portal will close as we stare blinking at the opportunities it presents us with. Thank you.
Oh, fantastic. So that was a really insightful and incredible look at the whole. We've seen all through COVID, there has been this drive, this repetition, this constant demand for a return to normal, where that normality was entirely dependent upon sacrifice zones, upon sacrificial land, sacrificial lives, and sacrificial communities. So what was really incredible in your talk and what kept on coming up was reimagining and the imagination. Could you, before we have any discussion, could you define degrowth for people? So for anyone who's never encountered the concept, what exactly is enough calling for? What is degrowth? How would you articulate it to someone?
Yeah, thanks, Scott. I think degrowth is the idea that it's a reverse of what were normally understood as to being the economic ideals. So capitalism is predicated on the idea that we grow always the economy and that is the metric for success. And degrowth argues that actually we need to do less. We need to make less, consume less, and be more. We need to work less, buy less. And so we need to degrow the economy. We need to do what's essential and useful and viable and ecologically sustainable. It's essentially, it's not possible within a capitalist framework. So it's also attempts to help us imagine a different way. And it's really built into our understanding of the world. And people think that our children grow and plants grow, and therefore growth is good. But as I put it to people, our children don't grow through the roof of our houses, and plants don't grow to become giant beanstalks. They're in a cycle of growth and decay and recompost and transformation. So I can definitely share some links from people who can articulate it better than I, but that's how I would put it.
Oh, fantastic. Do we have from any of our other collectives and provocateurs, do you have anything that is tied into your work that you'd like to pitch to Mike as well, or a question you would like to ask? So Orla or Anne, do either of you to want to come in with what did that bring up for you, like listening to the talk? And is there anything that's a parallel as well?
Yes, thanks, Scott, and thank you, Mike, for that very clear and eloquent provocation. I think that will chime with quite a lot of what I'm going to say a little bit later. And I suppose one version of degrowth that has been modelled is Kate Raworth's donut economic model. And I'm just wondering, maybe to get your input on what you think about that. And if you think it is a workable solution, because I'm interested because it comes from an economist, and so that's the implementing a circular economy has got to we've got to sell it basically. We've got to sell it to the world to buy in, to take it from the edges into the center as such. So I'd just be interested to hear your thoughts on that. And
just before you answer that, Mike, could I just kind of maybe elaborate a little bit more on that, because that's kind of where I was coming from as well. What I'm interested in, I think, is part of what Kate talks about and what other economists who are working in this area talk about, is about externalities. So the fact that GDP was never actually meant for the purpose that we now use it. And that one of the reasons it's not fit for purpose is that it only looks at financial growth, and actually, we depend on social and biodiversity and ecological systems to support those things, but we don't actually include them in the metric. And how we kind of get people to understand that it's not that they are effectively removing the foundation of our house, of our lives, by not actually including these things in the measure in the first place.
Mm-hmm. So just responding to those thoughts, I think that all of the ideas that we see emerging, whether that's universal basic income, a 4-day week, the donut city, the 15-minute city, the idea of neighborhoods, all are important and interesting to help these ideas percolate and land for people. I personally think that some of Kate's ideas are a little bit too designer oriented. They're almost like we can say, well, we'll have late capitalism, but we will design and implement some urban changes that will mean that it's okay. And my sense is that there will need to be more of a rupture than that you can't really redesign capitalism with all of its intrinsic contradictions in place, that there will need to be a more radical change. However, I view, so I talk about degrowth, but other people talk about post-growth, or other people talk about a well-being economy, and I'm not ideological about this. So I recognize that there are sort of a range of ideas and a family of ideas, and I'm an ally to all of those ideas, even if I have a critique of them. So I'm quite excited by the Donut City, but my feeling is that some of it sounds a little bit too technical and technocratic and design oriented to really land. So, but that doesn't mean I'm opposed to them. That's just the thing that nags in my mind about them.
Fantastic. But as well, to build upon that, if you mentioned Jason Hickel, and Jason's book, Less is More, he notes that we recycle less than 9% of what we take out of the earth. So even with this donut, there's 91% we're currently losing. And also to look at the model of cities, how we have developed them, they're entirely dependent upon imports, and it's unsustainable by design and by origin. So we do have these massive contradictions where, yeah, this is really interesting to get your take on degrowth as well as a well-being economy. Catherine Trebeck notes that in her book that she co-wrote on the economics of arrival. So knowing when we've arrived, when to make ourselves at home, when growth is not the only thing to focus on. And yeah, Cam, do we have any questions from the chat box that people would like we can pitch to Mike as well? And just to kind of keep everyone in the loop. And if there's things you want to put on the Miro board, it'd be fantastic to have a list of any articles you've mentioned, anyone you've cited, just to kind of build that up as a resource for people to go back to afterwards and to have this kind of archive of information.
Yeah, well, Andy's got his hand up, and there's also a question from Karen Anderson. So I'll pop you over to Andy first of all, and then Karen, if you're happy, I'll spotlight you afterwards.
Thanks, Cam. Yeah, I don't want to take a lot of space. I'm just really interested in Mike's premise there, where, realizing that decay is a natural thing, and how can we harness that as a part of our cycle, where we take all the positives of decay, but really ensure that we look after people. I mean, being based in Glasgow myself, and the city is in a cycle of decay, has been for decades, and people generally aren't looked after. So I just wonder, how can we reorientate our ideas about how we reorientate, because decay is natural, but it's always kind of seen as something to further extract as a business tool and not really look after people holistically.
I think that there's a dire need to bring together our socio and our ecological analysis, environmental justice. I was meaning decay in terms of natural processes, but I entirely take your point that social decay and poverty and inequality are endemic and are built into our society. And I would really make an appeal for environmentalists and ecologists to be far more aware of the need to ally social justice and environmental justice in their thinking.
Right, so we'll go to our next question as well. So Cam, if you can spotlight them, and we'll jump in with that too.
Yeah. Karen, are you happy to be spotlighted?
Yep, that's fine. Thank you. Now, my question was, can Scotland really, lead the way in terms of, looking at investment and stewardship as the future? We all know that our cities have redundant areas, redundant buildings that can be repurposed. Can we not get policy in place that says, look to these places before we develop? And again, it's all tied up clearly with the property market and with finance, but policy can play a place in shifting that balance.
Yeah, it's a really good question. How does degrowth and these ideas situate itself within Scotland? And that's quite complex. It's complex in terms of our constitutional situation and the idea of recovery and reconstruction, to put that in a national context. Without being nationalist, I would say I'm a Democrat rather than a nationalist, but I think that there is an opportunity to, in what I would call this liminal space, to reimagine Scotland in much more radical terms, and to combine these ideas of degrowth with the ideas of national renewal and social transformation. And I think within Scottish culture and history, there are some ideas that we can draw on. I think the idea of thrift, which is quite embedded in Scottish psyche, is something that can be cultivated in terms of degrowth. What does it mean to be thrifty, and to imagine that as a positive rather than a negative idea? I think there's some other problems and issues for Scotland. For example, we work a lot in the Highlands and Islands, which is an area that is an unnatural wilderness and has been stripped of its resources and its people. So in some senses, it's underdeveloped or de-developed. So talking about degrowth in the Highlands has a very different sense than talking about degrowth values in Glasgow or Dundee. So we need to work in that sense.
I suppose, both in common, both have, it's a Scottish, issue of community and of community empowerment, and Scottish government for better has led on community asset transfer, and I think it's that idea that you can actually merge the social issues with the built environment issues through policy and government investment, that I think we, I know the issue about nationalism, etc., but I do feel we have a scale, and we have an opportunity through that scale to make to make some progress that perhaps Westminster might find more difficult. Don't know.
Thank you very much for the input as well. So just before we have a wee comfort break, just to give everyone some time away from Zoom to stretch and be human again, would anyone from Decolonized Architecture like to kind of one last kind of point, maybe a question for Mike, or even a personal response to what we've been speaking about as well? So it'd be great to hear your input as well. And then after that, let's have a wee break afterwards. So anyone who'd like to come in?
I had a question for Mike, if that's okay. I think you'd mentioned, because the concept of degrowth, I'm personally new to that concept, and it's very interesting to hear the points that you've made. I wanted to ask about, you mentioned, I think, breaking away from the global economy, and for lack of a better term, almost a more inward-looking approach to, so, looking locally. How would that tie in with the aspects that the pandemic has highlighted, for example, like either PPE or vaccines, things that there's a blanket need for them around the world. How do we balance the two?
It's a really good question. I don't think that I would really frame it in terms of turning inward as creating local economies and local systems that are more sustainable, because globalization is essentially anti-ecological. But we can't go back hundreds of years. We exist in the world as it is, and there would be key things that are important to trade or connect with globally. But if we live in a more rational society, a more rational economy, we could begin to make some of those choices. Yeah. For example, in Fife, there are redundant shipyards with people who can manufacture offshore wind turbines. At the moment, those wind turbines are being transported to the yard, to the offshore wind farm that is a few miles from those very manufacturing yards. They're being transported from Indonesia to Scotland. They're being shipped, and the CO2 cost of that shipping is more than the wind farm will reduce. That's a level of insanity that's built into our system that is completely dysfunctional.
Right, yeah, I think that makes sense in what I was getting at. Thank you.
All right, brilliant. So we're now going to take a 5-minute comfort break.
Hello, everyone back. Hope you enjoyed your breakout comfort. So your comfort break. So we'll keep going with our next guest speaker, Orla Murphy from New European Bauhaus. The New European Bauhaus is a creative interdisciplinary initiative initiated by the European Union, a think tank at the intersection of art, culture, and science, convening spaces for transdisciplinary cross-pollination to design and imagine future ways of living. Situated at this crossroad between culture and social inclusion, its intention is to revisit Europe's cultural heritage while playing a proactive role in transforming its future. Our guest speaker, Orla Murphy, is an ambassador for the new European Bauhaus. She's an architect, owner of Custom Architecture, a lecturer at the University College in Dublin. She's a co-presenter of the RTE documentary series Building Ireland, and in 2017 she was appointed to co-curate the Irish Pavilion at the 2018 Venice Biennale. She's a co-director for the UCD Centre for Irish Towns, which is established in 2019, and represents on the advisor group to the Irish Government New Town Centre First Policy Development. So, hi Orla, it's a pleasure to have you here today. How are you?
I'm very good, thank you. Thank you very much, Matt. Thank you to Andy and Scott, and for everybody for joining this conversation today. It's been really interesting so far. And as you say, you've introduced, I think, the New European Bauhaus Initiative. To say just something before I start a little bit about that, it is an initiative designed by the EU under Ursula von der Leyen, the European Commission President herself initiated it as part of a vision to deliver the EU Green Deal. And I think really it came out of a realization that to decarbonize Europe by 2050 and to reduce CO2 emissions by 55% in just 9 years, that rules and regulations from the top are just not going to be enough. And it's really, I find it as an architect really heartening to see that there's a dawning on the idea that design is going to be necessary to conceive of and think about how how this new reality is going to come about, how we work together to design this world we want to live in. And so today I'm going to kind of have my European Bauhaus hat on, but also the hat of both an architect and a teacher, and speak a little bit about how this might impact, I suppose, on education, how we unlearn, relearn, how to be architects in this new world. So I'm just going to share a short presentation, hopefully. So I'm going to start with a kind of relook at this famous maxim, which was originally form follows function, which was coined by Lewis Sullivan in 1896, and it was correctly termed form ever follows function. And it became widely adopted as shorthand for the modernist theories that gave us functionalism, directing designers, industrial designers, and architects especially, to shape their work strictly to the functional requirements of their brief. Adam Floss's Ornament and Crime further underpinned the message in praise of minimalism, and Mies van der Rohe and others expanded that quest to design structures that communicated truth in their materiality. The original Bauhaus building in Dessau, designed by Walter Gropius, was a case study in functionalism. Glass curtain walls showed their inner workings of the building, and the built form of various elements was linked to functional requirements. It represented a paradigm shift from classical architecture, and while not without its faults, the Bauhaus undoubtedly contributed to a cultural change in the design of buildings, products, furniture, and textiles in the early 20th century. And I think, as was pointed out earlier by Decolonized Architecture, it really formed a Western perspective on architecture that dictated, I suppose, a lot of architectural discourse globally in the 20th century. And of course, the concerns of the post-industrial and post-World War I world, they're very different from today. So in this provocation, while connecting the new European Bauhaus to the roots of the original movement, I thought I would attempt to extend or deconstruct the maxim a little bit in the advent of the 26th Conference of the Parties, COP26, and as part of Architecture Fringe, so that maybe we might together unlearn this old maxim and seek out what form now needs to follow to deliver the stated objective of COP26, which is to keep to, as much as possible, a 1.5 degree temperature change. In particular, as an architect and educator, as well as the representative of the new European Bauhaus High-Level Roundtable, I'm keen to discuss how we can collaborate to design a new pedagogy that better fits the practice of architecture in the face of the climate crisis. So please bear with me as I briefly test a few alternatives of what form might now need to follow. Form follows carbon. So we know that combined construction industry and building operational emissions contribute to about 30% of overall global carbon emissions. Reducing this figure will depend on transition to lower carbon production of buildings and the continued shift to renewables to power building operations. The former demands a shift away from cement-intensive and steel construction in parallel with higher building performance standards for new buildings. The latter depends on scale out of renewable energy sources, as well as upgrade of energy performance of existing buildings. And so we need to know how to count carbon in our designs and how to evaluate life cycle performance towards net positive energy buildings and places, and to be able to assess embodied energy of existing buildings to make better informed decision about renovation, limiting demolition, and deep retrofitting. So yes, I do think form needs to follow carbon. However, of course, this is not enough because form also follows production. Shifting to low carbon materials and renewable technologies at the scale required isn't without its own supply chain challenges. According to findings from a joint United Nations Economic Commission for Europe and UN Food and Agriculture Organization study into future supply and demand scenarios, even if every effort were made to maximize global forest cover, doubling the use of wood in buildings, furniture, and other products would reduce rather than increase the amount of carbon sequestered globally. The authors write that the projected increase in wood product-based carbon in this scenario was not enough to offset the loss in biomass carbon due to increased removal of forest stocks. There are also questions over clear felling of forests for CLT production, with the potential to damage already fragile ecosystems at risk from current climate threats of drought, flood, and wildfire. And added to this is the land use requirement for food production and the potential displacement of rural communities. Meanwhile, production of polysilicon, a key component of solar panels, depends heavily on manufacture and processing based in Xinjiang in China, which produces almost half of the world's global supply of solar-grade polysilicon. The EU and other nations have voiced concern over the use of forced labour and detention of ethnic minorities involved in manufacture of these and other products. So very quickly, we start to see that form also follows politics. Negotiating a policy pathway to carbon neutrality is in everyone's interests, obviously, and hence the importance of COP26. That policy, or rather policies, the how of decarbonisation, isn't a one-size-fits-all model. There's no single solution to the climate crisis that does not potentially negatively impact on others, be they farmers, those who work in fossil fuel industries, or those whose lives, livelihoods and cultures are threatened in many cases, both by the impact of climate change and by the impact of decoupling our society from its dependence on carbon. And so, I think as Mike has also pointed out, form also follows justice, both social and spatial. This is why of the three core values of the new European Bauhaus, sustainability, beauty and inclusion, I think inclusion is possibly the most vital if systemic and behavioural change is to happen at the pace and scale big enough and fast enough to decarbonise society. Without designing for radical inclusion at the foundation of this new world, it will not succeed. And that's why change needs to be collectively co-created, process-driven, rigorous and radical. And I would argue it needs design thinking to engage deep listening in order to be able to conceive of and offer a better quality of life. A fundamental shift, that is, from an economy of growth, as we've discussed, predicated on winners and losers, to a circular economy of belonging. This challenge was visible in sharp relief during the pandemic as we witnessed spatial injustice in the lack of adequate housing and healthcare systems, lack of access to public space, and has highlighted the importance of access to nature and the benefits of neighbourhoods and community. A sign of hope was also seen, I feel, in how communities came together to care for the most vulnerable. And also at the bigger scale in how states could rapidly act in radical ways to avert the breakdown of healthcare systems. So I, for one, will never take it for granted again that when needed, the state cannot, for example, build affordable homes or house the homeless, because we've seen evidence to the contrary in the last year, over the last year. At a housing conference earlier this week, the body representing 13 million social housing tenants in Germany noted that renovation and upgrade of existing social housing stock was needed and was welcome. But who, they asked, is going to do all this work? And who is going to pay for it? And so, very quickly, form also follows economics. It surprises me, I admit, and this is again building on previous conversations, that forecasts for economic growth, national and continental, still come with a sense of this kind of best in class for those countries who forecast the highest percentage. Because where does this end? How can we, on the one hand, know and plan for a net zero carbon world when at the same time actively aim for continual economic consumer growth? If we want a circular economy, wouldn't it be better to have annual indicators of where this is being achieved and how? So Kate Raworth describes this new economy, I think, quite well in her donut economic model. And she says that between social and planetary boundaries lies an environmentally safe and socially just space in which humanity can thrive. And here we get to the point, I think, at which we see that form follows humanity, people at the heart of the process. In fact, considering the interdependence of humanity on every other living species, it's more useful, if a little bit less catchy, to expand this to form follows more than humanity. Shelley McNamara and Yvonne Farrell of Grafton Architects express this maxim much more beautifully in their invitation to architects to see the earth as client. So what does this mean for education and for learning? As a teacher, my first attempt to combine teaching architecture and climate change was in 2014 in a thesis group I taught in UCD called Adaptation with my colleague Fiona Hughes. COP21 had just successfully negotiated the Paris Agreement, and we were keen to explore what this might mean for architecture in an adapted world. We taught the studio over 3 years with curious, engaged students who explored everything from the building envelope to densification, mass timber construction, and to floodable cities. The theme has gradually become more embedded in all years across the curriculum in UCD where I teach. More recently, together with my colleague Emmett Scanlon and others, we've shaped a one-year Master of Architecture Design thesis course around the climate crisis. Now, at times, I think the scale of the challenge seems enormous, overwhelming in fact. Like rising sea levels, it can threaten to drown us in statistical predictions of doom, tipping points, parts per million of atmospheric carbon. In something close to an existential crisis for the profession, our students began to wonder what future there really is for architectural practice. Perhaps we'd be better just to down our tools, stop designing new buildings, sandpaper, and reuse, repair, and recycle. And as a teacher, I'll freely admit that I felt challenged to keep up with changing technical skills while maintaining or building knowledge about the evolving bigger picture. But then I think you stand back and take a breath and admit that yes, architecture is political. Yes, architecture is complicit. No, not all building is architecture, and no, architecture, and by extension architects, won't solve the climate crisis, at least not on their own. And also that rules and regulations on their own won't be enough. When, as Naomi Klein so clearly points out in her book, This Changes Everything, we need to design this new system from the ground up, supported from the top down. But to do that, we must be able to imagine what this new world is like. And hence, I think the skills of architects are now actually needed more than ever. The very fact that the new European Bauhaus is an initiative explicitly valuing the necessity for design that is inclusive, sustainable, and beautiful, to tie together and cut across all the other complex parts of the jigsaw that form follows, underlines the better late than never value of design thinking. And so given the above, what should or could teaching and learning for architecture look like? So I'm just going to offer here 3 types of learning that might extend the form follows more than humanism, building on the invitation to first unlearn and then relearn. The first is learning with. So I think architecture education could be more open, more fluid, and much more equal. Less about us teaching and students learning, and more about a joint endeavour to identify and respond to specific spatial challenges in the built environment. It could also be more open and fluid between institutions, open source knowledge sharing, joint prototyping, and deconstruction of silos. This is happening. I think this event today is an example of that. NEB Goes South is another. And it has been accelerated in the last year as we could much more easily visit and attend schools and other places virtually. The Erasmus programme is evidence of the enormous benefit of cross-pollination of learning and experience. We can't know it all of the time, so let's share our respective knowledge and collaborate more. Recent initiatives like Architects Declare are also founded on open sharing of knowledge and experience. This year of experimental emergency online teaching has demonstrated that when necessary, we can pivot to deliver teaching and learning remotely, but it has also shown the equal value of peer-to-peer learning that happens around the edges. And it confirmed to me the value of studio-based learning. Our students really didn't miss us as teachers at all. In fact, they probably saw us more than ever, but they did really miss their peers. And learning at the edges is a vital, if ungraded, component of architectural education. The next type of learning I call learning from, and I think we can embrace material conditions, the physical, cultural, and societal context in which architecture is embedded, and the people and communities connected to them. While design responses are also physical, the stuff of the built environment, the outputs, also sometimes need to be strategic, political, or methodological. We might relieve each other somewhat of the burden to carry all of the knowledge and its rapidly changing data around all of the time. However, I think the skill of systems thinking, which is embedded within architectural education, can help to understand how the levers of change have direct or indirect impacts. So for example, if timber is planned as a key renewable construction material, the supply and manufacturing it will need to be planned to facilitate this. It also has impacts for local economies, biodiversity, and ecosystems. Being aware of the dynamics of these systems is useful to help inform design and decisions. But we might also value the ability to imagine and visually communicate what the world we want to live in actually looks like. And the third is learning for. We can take some assurance, I think, from the fact that there is no one solution to the climate crisis and that no one has all the answers. Be suspicious, I think, of anybody who says that they do. But that also, in a way, all of us hold the answers, or at least the agency to imagine them. We might embrace failure a bit more, encourage each other as co-learners to take risks and become, in a way, design pirates. Prototype, imagine, test, fail, test again, and then send these postcards out into the world for discussion. Open the doors and welcome the world outside in more, taking care too about how we communicate, which can sometimes unwittingly exclude others. While working remotely this year, our students placed their final work back into its context as prompts for conversation and discussion. And the students hosted a public webinar research design, looking at the work under the themes of care, building, and the future. I think handing agency for more outward-facing education over to students is something that we would like to expand. It's heartening as well to see over 2,300 entries for the first New European Bauhaus Prize, the vast majority of which are trying novel prototyping strategies at a small local scale to test new ways of working that connect place and people. Next year in UCD, we plan to fold the 3 core values of sustainability, beauty, and inclusion into some of our courses, including the Master of Architecture course next year. And perhaps an invitation to other universities to consider this might be of interest, with a view maybe for coming together next summer to share the work and findings of students. So in conclusion this morning, as part of the provocation, while I acknowledge the need to unlearn, I propose to add on to this the invitation to relearn by learning with, by learning from, and learning for. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we're going to switch up a little bit again. So we're now going to pass to Anne for her provocation as well, and then we'll bring both of you in for another discussion. So I'll pass to Matt for introductions, and we'll take it from there. And thank you very, very much for the provocation. That was fantastic. And it was a lovely reinterpretation of learning as well.
Yeah, thank you for your intriguing provocation and great presentation. So I will now introduce you our last guest speaker for today, Anne Johnston from After the Pandemic. After the Pandemic is an accelerator for change, incubating and enabling creative projects that impact our society, cities, and the environment for the better. The initiative develops ideas through the collaboration of local communities, creative practitioners, and like-minded organizations. They fund and deliver cultural and art installation programs and content, educational toolkits for schools and research, along with events and community engagement and outreach. Their mission is to rethink, reimagine, and redesign the world around us to be greener, more resilient, and vibrant. So Anne Johnston is a project manager for After the Pandemic. She has over 20 years experience in environmental and sustainability consultancy with a particular focus on the built environment and brownfield land. She has been involved with After the Pandemic since last June, and as I mentioned before, she took the role of the project manager since January this year. So hello, Anne, how are you?
I'm very well, Matt, thank you very much. Okay, I shall just share my screen. Thank you very much for the introduction, and I'm absolutely delighted to be here today, and it's been a fascinating morning listening to all the presentations. And I think, you know, the one word that's kind of come up repeatedly, which is probably one of the main things that After the Pandemic is all about, is reimagine. So I'm just going to kind of explain a little bit more about, you know, what After the Pandemic is, who we are and what we're doing, and then specifically what we're doing for COP26. So After the Pandemic is an accelerator for change. It incubates and enables creative projects and develops ideas and projects through collaboration. So that's with local communities, creative practitioners, like-minded organisations, and where it came from really was in the first lockdown. There were 3 people, Graham Hogg, Laura McCard and Fergus Bruce. Fergus is in the audience somewhere today as well, so I'm sure at the end when we get to the discussion he'll be happy to jump in as well and maybe explain a bit more about that. But you know, in that first lockdown when everything kind of came to a halt and there was a big pause. You know, they sat back and they were listening to all the discussion about people talking about Build Back Better and green recovery, and noted that there wasn't really any place in that for creativity, for design. You know, it was all very much, as we've already touched on here, focused on the economic side of the recovery. And that is where, after the pandemic came from, they set out a mission to rethink our environment, reimagine our cities, and redesign our communities. So the first thing they did was they published a manifesto in response to COVID-19. And from that manifesto, they invited people to kind of to join them in getting involved and collaborating, regardless of what their discipline was. So what they actually did in practice was issue a number of design briefs, put them out into the world with absolutely no idea how people were going to respond to them. But in the event, they were overwhelmed with responses, and that led to a summer school in June last year. So really, yes, it was all about crisis. We were in a crisis, but how could we bring creativity in order to create change? So the summer school was the kind of like first manifestation of after the pandemic's work, which is basically split into 3 stages: incubating ideas, accelerating projects, and creating tangible outcomes. And for my own personal perspective, this was the point at which I got involved with after the pandemic. So I had, you know, my kind of lockdown 1 story was I was a partner in a real estate consultancy, so very much in the corporate world. I had kind of felt uncomfortable with that for quite a while, but then because of it, you know, essentially that crisis brought things to a head, and I realised that I could not continue in that job and contributing towards the system in the way that I had been doing, and that, you know, morally that just wasn't aligned with my values. So I decided to quit my job and leave and set up my own business. And almost exactly coincidentally with that, I came across after the pandemic. So I got in touch and said, I really like what you're doing and I would be interested in helping you. And that's kind of how we came onto our COP project, but I'll come on to that in a little bit. Before I do that, I'd just like to kind of walk you through a case study of how this kind of 3-stage approach actually works. And that case study is Under the Bridge, which is a piece that came about from the idea of a musician called Sarah Wagner. And Sarah is a violinist who's just graduated from the Royal Conservatoire. And she realised that she wasn't going to be able to apply her craft, and you know, there wasn't going to be any playing in concert halls for the foreseeable future. So she kind of looked around herself and thought, well, if I can't do that, what can I do? And she filmed herself playing in the space underneath the Kingston Bridge, which actually is a huge cathedral-like space. And Sarah's thesis was, well, you know, this space in normal times is a car park for like 50 cars. Why can't it be a performance space? Why can't we reclaim this as a public space for art and performance? And what After the Pandemic did was took that idea and brought it to life. And the acceleration was pairing Sarah up with an street artist called Panda. And for those of you who are familiar with Glasgow, you've probably seen his work. He paints the big heaths. That's what's in the picture behind him. And so Panda created an artwork. Sarah played her piece, and it was Vivaldi's Four Seasons, and it was the summer movement. And then over the course of the summer, as lockdown restrictions eased, a few more musicians were added and the piece was created. And the After the Pandemic team filmed that and created a 12-minute piece that we put online. And then the kind of creation part was taking that idea and adding other movements. So in winter, we did Under the Bridge Winter, with another street artist called Sai, who created this artwork, which is actually, it was an old advertising hoarding that sits on the site that we're using for COP, which he painted to kind of be evocative of the Northern Lights. And at the moment, Sarah is working with some other performers, dancers this time, to create Under the Bridge Spring. So that kind of gives you an idea of the concepts and how it's applied, and how this, you know, the importance of actually bringing people together who, you know, might not normally work together from very, very different worlds, and therefore making their message more accessible to a much, much wider audience. So we have 5 principles that we've set ourselves, that all of this work that we try and, you know, effectively, this provides us with our framework for the projects that we do. And those are inclusive communities. So we want to, this is, you know, for everyone. We want to contribute to and connect with global communities. Dear Greenest Place, Glasgow is our primary community of interest. Glasgow has a net zero commitment by 2030, and we want to commit towards working towards that as well. Local for global, for global change to happen, and again, it's something I think we've touched on here a number of times this morning, that global level of change can seem overwhelming. So it's important to start local, it's important to make it meaningful to people on a level that resonates with their daily lives. And that means tackling things from a kind of grassroots approach. And then picking up on what Orla was talking about, learn and grow. We need to develop skills and share knowledge in order to take action. And one of the main reasons after the pandemic is not about COP, but we are harnessing the opportunity of it happening in Glasgow to try and make things happen that we feel need to happen. And among that is creating an inspired and empowered and knowledgeable citizen that is able to kind of understand that, you know, these kind of very high level discussions that are going on at this big global conference will have real world impacts on their life, and that they are entitled to ask questions about that, and giving them the tools to be able to do that. And then underpinning all of that is design forward. So again, this space for design, this space for creativity, and catalysing communities, you know, whether they are actual communities, whether it's a community of architects, whether it's a community of you know, technical people, whether it's a community of artists, to contribute towards designing a circular future. So over the past year, we've built up a huge network of partners and collaborators and supporters, like some of them on the screen there. So I've said, you know, there was the summer school, and that was followed in November by an international symposium that had people contributing to it from all over the world. And we have continued to build this network, and that is a really important part of what we're doing. It's multidisciplinary and it's cross-sector, and we will continue to do that to COP and beyond. So the projects that we're working on at the moment, I'm going to go into, obviously, after the pandemic at COP in a bit more detail, but it's only one of a number of projects that after the pandemic is actually working on. So there's a few others on the screen there. The Grace of Pollock Design School is something that's been going on for a few months, and it's a really fantastic project working with the people of Pollock, in particular with some school children who are being given tools in order to help them articulate what their place means to them and what they want for the future of the place where they live. We're producing a number of atlases, some design toolkits. We'll be running more symposia, and then there's also some specific things that we're doing as well, like art challenges in summer schools. The COYO challenge, which is in the corner there, is being run with a charity called Class of Your Own, which is a design project which is aimed at 11 to 16-year-olds, and that's live at the moment. So what are we doing for COP? What is what's that actually all about? Essentially, it's back to this idea of, for big change, start local, and And this is where, you know, this kind of sparking of ideas when you bring people from very different backgrounds together comes from. So when I had, going back to that original conversation I had with Graham and Fergus, a lot of the work that I've done over my career has been around vacant and derelict land and brownfield sites. And there's Glasgow in particular has a huge issue with vacant and derelict land. The statistic, the Scottish Land Commission has just launched a website called myland.scot, which has lots of really, really fascinating stories on it of what local people are doing with land in their areas. But there's also a statistic on there that says that, you know, people in your average Scot lives within 500 metres of a vacant and derelict site. And in Glasgow, that's actually more like within 100 metres. So they're, you know, these sites, a lot of them are micro, they are like everywhere. And they have a really kind of negative effect often on the communities that live around them. And that is disproportionately on poor communities, because they're much more likely to be in poorer parts of the city for like lots of different reasons. So I felt it was really important to do something for COP in Glasgow that involved using vacant and derelict land and showing how it actually could be part of the solution and part of a positive contribution towards the climate crisis. But it was very difficult to engage any of the authorities in that discussion. So when I started talking to Graham and Fergus, we just had a look at an aerial photo of Glasgow and we said, let's be cool if we could find a piece of vacant and derelict land and just do something ourselves. And this site is called City Wharf, and it sits on the Broomielaw, which is basically the street that runs along the north side of the River Clyde. And it is almost exactly equidistant between the city centre and the SDC, where COP will take place. It's privately owned. It's owned by a landowner called Dandara, and they have planning consent for a build-to-rent development on the site. So within the next 5 years, probably, this site will have 3 blocks of apartments on it. And this site that sits immediately next door to it will also have a mixed use but predominantly residential development. So we went to Dandara and said to them, can we have access to a bit of your land to do something for COP? And they said yes, and they gave us a license to occupy. And so we now have control over about 3,000 square metres of this site, which we are intending to activate as a creative, cultural and community hub for Glasgow, but also more widely in the run-up to and during COP26. And what we want it to be, so we are not an official COP event. We're not a Glasgow City Council event, although we've got the council's support. This is a bunch of people who've just seen an opportunity and taken it and decided we're going to do something here. And for us, it is going to be focused on the community. This is the space for the community to come and have their conversations, and hopefully to create a lasting legacy for the city and for Scotland and for other communities all around the world. In terms of the site's history, it's a really interesting bit of Glasgow, and I think again this kind of comes back to quite a few things that we've talked about today. It's in Anderston, and Anderston was in the kind of like early 20th century and like late 19th, early 20th century. Anderston was a really bustling part of Glasgow. It was in the heart of the shipbuilding area. It was where a lot of the kind of like immigrant communities came to. So when people migrated down from the Highlands, when they came over from Ireland, this would have been the part of Glasgow that a lot of them lived in. And it was a very, very vibrant community. The site itself was occupied by a whiskey bond. That's a building that you can see in the picture there, until 1960, when tragically the building went on fire. And then the fire caused an explosion which blew out the whole front facade, and it resulted in quite a significant loss of life. There were 19 men killed and 6 salvage crew who had come to help them from a salvage operation on the Clyde. And there's nothing to mark this on the site. If you go to the site now, there is absolutely nothing there that you would ever know that that was its history. So part of the legacy that we are working with the landowner to make sure that in future there's some kind of commemoration actually on site about this. But what happened subsequently was, so it went from the whole area was also changing at the same time. So that was 1960. The site then lay vacant, and then by the 1970s, the Kingston Bridge had been put through, cut through the city, bringing the M8 through Glasgow. And that kind of cauterized this whole area of Glasgow. So although in that previous image that I showed you, it's 10 minutes walk from the city centre, actually in the kind of a lot of Glaswegians would tell you that they wouldn't actually be sure how to get there. It's not clear how you get there. It's actually quite easy to get lost. It doesn't have, psychologically, it feels far away, and it feels far away because it's not a very nice bit of the city. It's been vacant for 50 years, 60 years. You have to pass the motorway. It's very, very, it's all concrete, it's grey, it's brown, it's, people, it just, so it's almost like this kind of black hole in people's minds. And that's why, we probably could have done what we're going to do on some other site where it would have been a lot easier, but that's where it kind of comes back to this issue about it being important that it is a piece of vacant and derelict land. We want to see that transformation, and we want to show that these kinds of sites can be sustainable, they can be vibrant, they can be creative, and even if it is just for a meanwhile use, that you are, that you can take that and it can contribute positively towards the development of a community or towards the sustaining of a community. So what we're actually going to do over the next few months is, until August, it's effectively going to be what we're calling a space for reflection. It'll, there'll be some things, we'll be starting to activate it. There'll be a few things going on, but we'll be building up activity. We are actually going to have structures on this site. There will be a number of pavilions that are themed around our principles, and that activity is going to ramp up towards COP. So by the time we get to September and October, it'll be a space for engagement. So we'll be starting to invite people down to the site and doing specific activities aimed at particular groups. So it might be school children, it might be university students, it might be a particular local community group. We're working with lots, and you might have seen some names on the slide I showed of partners, so people like the Scottish Refugee Council, the Glasgow Community Food Network. So we might do kind of specific things throughout September, October with individual groups. And then by the time we get to November, we will have a site that we will open to the public, and that will be the space for action. And there'll be all sorts of things going on during COP. But then after COP, although a lot of what we actually do will be temporary and we'll be demounting it and it will be getting recycled or it will be getting sent to a new home, there will be elements that will remain on site, and also all of those ideas and relationships that have been created. Our hope, our aspiration is that they go on, and that people are inspired or empowered to go and do things within their own communities because of what they've seen on our site. So from that kind of really grim, grey, brown site, what we're aiming for is for it to be vibrant and colourful, and a lot of this, kudos here to Andy and to Matt, who brought a lot of these images to us. But in terms of when I'm talking about pavilions, this is the inspiration that we're looking at. We've got to still think about things like COVID. One of the advantages of this site is that it is outside, and we're probably going to have to retain a lot of that openness in order to actually be able to allow people to come onto the site. But it's November in Scotland, so there's a number of design challenges that we need to think about and that we need to overcome. We are bootstrapping all of this, and we've got basically no money, and we have no time either. So it's not an insignificant challenge, but that's why we're building all these partnerships. we will get there. We will get somewhere, and we will have. This is what we're aiming for, and for our site to have this kind of feel about it, even if it's not going to look exactly like this. So our objectives are primarily, you know, the kind of the way it's split up here. The main focus for us is on that local engagement. We want there to be a meaningful representation of Glasgow as a whole city. You know, so other COPs, you know, obviously everyone knows now about the Paris Agreement, but in 2015, if you'd asked someone what the Paris Agreement was, you know, even people who should have known and would probably have drawn a blank. So it's synonymous with Paris now, but if you'd been in Paris in 2015, the actual conference itself took place in an airport hangar, but you know, right out at Orly Airport and not really in the city at all. And other COP, you know, COP 15 in Copenhagen, and you know that there's no real kind of character of those cities that goes along with the actual conference itself. So we want this to be Glaswegian. We want it to feel Glaswegian. We want the voices of all citizens to be represented on the world stage, not just the ones that are invited in. And obviously that's another thing about COVID. It's hard to kind of engage with COP at the best of times, but it's going to be even harder this year. And we want to kind of do that translation of helping people to understand what climate change means for them in the context of their own lives, inspiring action, as I said, and developing skills through education and apprenticeships. But after the pandemic started as a digital initiative, and so that will be a really important part of what we do as well. So even if COP, you know, it seems to be full steam ahead at the moment, but we still don't really know. Even if it was cancelled or postponed at this point, we will carry on with what we're doing, because as I said, this isn't, after the pandemic, is not about COP. COP has just given us that kind of, you know, lighthouse moment to really kind of have a lot of discussions and open a lot of doors, frankly. And then the physical aspect, we're giving purpose to derelict land and creating a usable public space in a place that, you know, might otherwise just have been used for parking or storing stuff, or, you know, or nothing. It could just have lain there the way it is, while we've invited all these people to, you know, to put their eyes on our city for these 12 days. And then global, you know, it is also about Glasgow as the host city for COP. And, you know, we want to be a host for people who want to engage no matter where they are in the world. And when we're thinking about creating those connections, we're also thinking about creating connections between local communities in different places, who are experiencing the sharp end of the climate emergency, and maybe feel like they are, you know, they're alone, but they're, you know, but they aren't. And if they're not getting what they need from their own global, like their national leaders, that they can kind of come together and create that grassroots movement. So during COP itself, we are planning to have a programme of events that will have a different theme for each day. This is our theme at the moment, although we haven't it's not kind of completely settled yet. But we will be essentially on each day, we are going to work with different partners to focus on each one of these themes, and to run different sessions that are aimed at also at different groups. So whether it's families, whether it's, you know, young people, and whether it's older people, whether it's people with accessibility challenges. And we want those sessions to be led by Glaswegian and Scottish voices, but to be inclusive, and to invite people in from all over the world. And there will be a blend of lots of different things like presentations and workshops and performances, and hopefully that'll be on the site, and also that space under the bridge as well. And that's how you can contact us. And that's where we are at the moment, and we'll see where we get by November. Thank you.
Thank you,
All
Anne.
right. Fantastic. So we're just gonna bring you and Orla to have a quick kind of conversation, because a really kind of beautiful parallel in that was that imagining the future and looking forwards. So there's a really lovely quote from Rob Hopkins' latest book, From What Is to What If. And it's the difficult challenge is not about imagining utopia, it's about imagining when things turned out just okay. So not even looking towards a kind of entirely green, capitalism is entirely gone immediately tomorrow morning and we can all be joyful immediately. It's about just casting forward and using the imagination, and really just on the theme of kind of education, design and culture. What kind of suggestions on collaborations even between what you both do? How would you combine your work, or how would you like to play off of that? That would be quite an interesting thing to hear from you both. So Orla, if you'd like to begin, and we'll just take a couple from each.
Yeah, I mean, I think collaboration is it's key, and I was just really interested listening to your presentation and about how to bring those who are outside of the conversation about climate change, because they're too busy, their lives are too just consumed with trying to get through the day or their job, how to bring them into the and let them feel listened to and hear from their experiences and stories, because it's very clear that to create the kind of change we need, it's got to require everybody. One way we're looking at that through the Centre for Irish Towns that I'm involved with is in a project called Ripple, which we applied for funding for, which is about trying to build resilience using water, but collaborating with communities in a deprived part of in a town in Mayo, in the west of Ireland. And it's exactly trying to look at those challenges of building capacity and resilience from the ground up. So it's not about imposing it, but it's co-designing solutions that are focused on resilient infrastructures and place and people. So that's just one example of a small project that I think is trying to get some of those very difficult challenges, because there's a tendency that the conversation around climate change remains sort of, you know, in the realms of the academy or the elite or those who have power and control over these systems. So how do we broaden that out and make the change much more tangible and local, and then get that ripple to happen? And I think there's a thing called ripple effect mapping, which we're interested in using as a technique to see the effects of that change, and how do you measure it and evaluate it and then apply it more broadly. So that's just one example. And I think technology is enabling us to create these collaborations much more fluidly and easily. So it's about kind of harnessing these kind of the macro scale, and then also trying to feed it out much more rapidly and broadly at the local scale. That's my sense of what needs to happen. And it's clear that it is happening. After the pandemic, it's a fantastic example of something, you know, of that happening.
Yeah, totally. And for me, I think there's a few things that there's loads. Some are like, oh God, where do I start? But one of those is just to start. You know, I think there's a really big issue, I think, and it might be to do with, I think it does kind of go back to education, and just you know, no matter what subject you study, like how we the whole kind of like attitude around it and around what an expert is, and therefore who is allowed to talk about something, and in this area, and you know, when we're thinking about the climate emergency and how we deal with it, you know, people have different skills that they bring, but really there is no such thing as an expert, because you cannot know all of it, and that is, I think, a realization that people need to come to, and that, you know, the reason that I have, you know, been so kind of and you know, that I am so passionate about after the pandemic is that it's about that, you know, no matter what your area of expertise is, you've got to be able to tell the story. And if you can't tell the story, then, you know, you're not going to get anyone on board, whether that is at that local community level, or whether it's at the, you know, the finance level, or the, you know, the kind of policy and decision making level. And I mean, just to kind of give an example of, you know, when I was working in my previous job, so, you know, my job was to kind of, I ran this, you know, sustainability team, and there were lots of other teams within the company that were doing other things, and I had this conversation with one of my colleagues about who was on the kind of more project management side. So they're the ones that are actually, if you've got a building and you are you're doing a refurb and you're thinking about whether to put PV panels on the roof or whatever, that would have been their bit. My team would have advised on it, but he kind of said to me, well, this client really likes what we do. We're just going to carry on doing our thing. You do your thing. But we won't, we'll just kind of carry on doing it separately. And I had to say to him, well, no, because my thing fundamentally changes your thing, and if we don't do it together, then it's going to fail. And that kind of comes back to what you were saying about silos. And it's not so much about what my area of expertise was. It's about what's the issue that we're trying to address here, and not having that, putting egos aside about who can do what, and bringing people together, including people that might, have no formal expertise, but they know that area, or, they kind of, they spent 50 years working with in joinery or whatever they were doing, and actually listening to them and creating the space to allow their voice to be heard.
It's interesting what you say about stories, and with Free Market, the exhibition that we put together around Irish towns, when we toured it after the Venice Biennale to Irish towns, we reconfigured it to be all about listening to stories of people in those towns, because it became increasingly clear to us that firstly, that people in towns had really deep knowledge about their place. They knew it intimately and what needed to happen for it to continue to thrive, and B, that those stories weren't normal part of policy making. So what we tried to do was to gather those stories, really listen, not say that we're not the experts, you guys are, and then so how do we steer this into those who are writing the policy? And again, I think it's kind of trying to put ego aside about experts and knowledge, and listening, deep curiosity, and then connecting that so that there's a cycle of more finely tuned and bespoke and for what needs to happen, that's attuned to specific places.
All right, thank you both for pulling all that together. And I've even found personally in work that I do around climate change is storytelling keeps on coming up no matter where you look. Kind of the power of a good story in proving something's not impossible, and it just keeps on coming up. So what we're going to do now is just pull all of our kind of provocations, all of our speakers, just to have a really quick kind of go around everyone, and what is something kind of reflections from today, what is something that stood out to you powerfully, or what is something you've learned that will be a takeaway. So we're going to pull Decolonized Architecture, Enough, the European Bauhaus, and After Pandemic. And Anne mentioned Fergus as well, so we can spotlight Fergus to bring him in, so we can just have everyone who spoke and who's contributed. And it would be really incredible to hear what has stood out to you from this morning to now afternoon, and what's the kind of parallels in thinking, the new things, the reimagining, the unlearning, the relearning. And yeah, so we'll just throw this to Harsha first, and just hear your thoughts on what we've been kind of going over, the conversation we've just had, and what are you going to do next as a result of this as well? That would be quite interesting. And just once you finish speaking, pick someone's name, and we'll just do it that way so we can all keep each other moving along. And then after this, we're going to hear from the Architecture Fringe team, kind of reflecting on the theme of unlearning. And we also must note that Harsha suggested this as something that we've decided to take on because it was an incredible idea and something we didn't want to leave out. So if you'd like to lead this off and pick someone's name afterwards, and we'll start jumping through these.
Sure. Thanks for that, Scott. I think one of the biggest takeaways from the other speakers that we've heard is, I think we had approached it a little bit as just kind of unlearning, but it is very interesting to see how unlearning and relearning can work together, and learning also how to differentiate between what needs to kind of be rediscovered versus what needs to just be discovered differently. So I think especially paired with, as Mike said about degrowth, it's quite interesting to see how in the future we're going to have so many opportunities to learn from the future as well as from the past, while reinventing what architecture means and how we can approach climate change and sustainability as something that's already been existing, but not in ways that we've seen it before. And I really liked, Orla, what you said about learning with and learning for. And I think that's a really lovely way of prioritizing what needs to be done and when. And it's really promising to see that just because like we're students doesn't necessarily mean that we have to necessarily like bring about change, or that there is a wider audience that's willing to and ready to kind of accept that things need to keep moving and need to keep moving in multiple directions. So I thought that was really nice. Tanya, what would you like to say to that?
Yeah, quite similar to Harsha. I've enjoyed kind of the parallels that Mike made between growth and progress, and kind of how can we explore the different ways to make progress compared to the way it traditionally has been, as in for the sake of constant expansion. And how can we kind of, as within the built environment and the construction industry, value kind of mutual aid. And after kind of the past year we have like lighter luggage, and how can we collectively kind of start afresh and work towards that more as a group, just kind of the overall sense of this is a new beginning. So yeah, Mohit.
Yeah, I think that those were some incredible presentations, and what I quite liked was that the link between what Orla and Anne were talking about was basically like recently coming out of architecture school, you have been taught the form follows function approach, but then how you broke down the impetus to look at it through different, all these multiple different lenses, and gave examples for all of those, and then what after the pandemic is doing, and almost it was like a complementary, like practical approach to taking these the issues seen within the city and how those can be manifested into the built form. And I think those were it was a perfect like manifestation of all those points. And I'll pass on to Jasmine.
Thank you. Yeah, I guess similar to what the others have been saying, it's just been so energizing and really eye-opening to hear from all of the different provocations this afternoon. And I think, of course, within our own work, we all approach things sometimes in a certain way, and it's really useful and kind of well, obviously educational for each of us to hear about what everyone else is doing and how it can feed into our own work. So I know for me personally, I was really excited by the work that Anne's doing, and I've bookmarked your website already. I'm really looking forward to all of the events that will be unfolding on your site. And yeah, it just got me thinking a lot about how we can kind of intertwine some of the principles that have been spoken about today within our own work at Decolonized Architecture. I'll pass on to Fergus.
Yeah, thanks, Jasmine. Thanks very much. Sorry for sort of parachuting in at the very end after Anne did all the work. But yeah, what really exciting for me through all of this, and on the Adobe, I think Adobe houses, if we can get Glaswegian Adobe sorted out somehow, that would be great. But it's about, for me, it's to what Orla said, and what a lot behind the original impetus for after the pandemic was people's lives and trying to communicate, give people a clearinghouse and a nexus to bring all these strings together, right? So, and to understand sort of the social, economic and kind of personal causation behind the intersecting challenges, because parsing it all into something that somebody can digest and then act upon, and then know where to go and act upon it, who to speak to about their local built environment, how to go about improving it, where to get the resources to do it. That's the overarching kind of drive for me, is to try and find a way of bringing all of these cross-pollinated and cross-pollinating creative endeavors, and thinking about your local economy, your local environment, your local your capacity to build and grow locally, and connecting that to the macro scale, and how that people can use that as a kind of driver for their own action. But I think that particularly in the context of the built environment, the lockdowns gave people a very direct sense of how their habitat and the where they live, literally the 4 walls they were stuck within, the 12 streets they could walk around every day, impacted their mood and the way they felt in a way that they might not have done when they were going about their day-to-day jobs or living their normal life. So I think there's definitely a moment where people's awareness of the built environment, the habitats they live in, is more acute than perhaps it was before, and that's something for built environment practitioners to focus on, I think. I'll hand over to Mike.
Thanks. Really inspiring sessions, and just a few brief thoughts. The first thing is that I think my impression is that we're kind of surfacing some of these networks that exist, and people are doing kind of very similar work, but on different levels. And in the past year, we've really been isolated. So it's important to make these connections and move out of our silos and kind of recognize each other's work. And I think that I'm very excited about the possibility of cross-fertilization and working in collaboration with many of you in the next time. The second thought I had was somebody, I'm not sure if it was Anne or Orla, mentioned about specialism and expertise. And this is something that Geddes talks about a lot, and I think could be really useful for us working in Scotland, is to bring to the fore the Scottish generalist tradition that Geddes comes out of, which is very empowering and sees people's specialism and expertise as a gift to society and the community in which they're in, rather than something that just elevates them. And I think that idea of generalism and radical democracy is going to be essential in empowering the grassroots action that we know that we need. So just a big thank you to the organisers for such a great event. And I will ask Anne next.
Thanks, Mike. So I think one of the big things for me, listening to everybody else, is about the challenging assumptions. Like Mohit, when you put up that image of the towers with the really clever, shading system on it, initially I was like, that's incredible, but then the challenge is, but why was it needed? Why were these glass towers built in the first place? And I think that just asking that question more often and feeling confident enough to follow through and like think, A, I'm allowed to ask questions, and B, I'm allowed to challenge these assumptions, is really it is massively empowering, and I think that kind of came through in all the presentations. And Mike, I'm now I'm really looking forward to your book. No pressure, but I think that whole thing about Geddes and definitely that kind of like the radical democracy and feeling like you're that you don't need to do things for personal glory, is yeah. So I'll be reading it when you finish it. So I'll pass on to Orla. Thanks.
Thanks, Anne. I should say my colleague, the co-director of the Irish Centre for Irish Science, he did his PhD thesis on Patrick Geddes, so he's a massive Geddesian fan. So it's really nice to kind of hear that what he has brought to the theory of what we're talking about now, this huge challenge, is alive and very much thriving in Scotland. And I think I mentioned it in the chat, Ireland is looking very much to Scotland as a leader, particularly in relation to a lot of what you're talking about, Scottish land, and that kind of the knowledge that kind of radical change needs to happen to activate our cities and towns, and the systems, the economic and power-based systems that are quite embedded in them in order to release the land for better use. I suppose I was really struck by the positive atmosphere of the event, and delighted about that, because I think it's really important that we don't allow this to weigh us down. And Tanya, I think you mentioned lighter luggage, which is just a lovely metaphor for, I think, how we might emerge as we get back to teaching and learning and working together, hopefully by September more so, given that that's going to be different and it's an opportunity for change, Mike, as you pointed out. But that ability to be nimble, to act with kind of surgical precision in places broadly, and that's highlighted, I think, by the After the Pandemics project as part of COP, I think is also really hopeful, because it's clear, you know, this isn't about acting in a kind of a fluffy hippie sort of way. And sometimes I feel myself merging into, my God, I'm becoming a communist, but this isn't about that at all, actually. It's about reinventing the world to be a better place that's fair. And to do that, we've actually got to be quite active, quite nimble, quite tactical and intelligent about how we do that. And so just from listening to the presentations today, I was really filled with just massive hope, in fact, about what that might mean, about and what it might mean in a positive sense. It's not about closing doors, it's actually about opening them. It's about collaborating and about being tactical, nimble, and carrying around this lighter luggage in order to imagine this new, better world. And there's a huge opportunity to do that now. So thank you very much just to everybody at Architecture Fringe for organizing this event. It's really, really kind of buoyed me up for the time ahead.
Oh, thank you all so much for sharing, and for what you've all brought. You've brought an invaluable addition to the whole programme, and as a kind of closing event to the core programme, it's incredible to know it's been hopeful and energising, and it's made all of it beyond worth it. So now we're going to pass to the Architecture Fringe team, and we're going to get some reflections on the production of this year's festival and upon the theme of unlearning as well. So Andy, Rita and Leanne, you can take it away as well.
Thank you, Scott. It's Rita's had to leave, so Neil's with us, and my colleagues Leanna here as well. I think, you know, taking this event as a sort of conceptual essence for what we've been up to with the unlearning provocation, you know, we sort of established this provocation at the end of 2019. We've explored it through the festival through different strands or topics such as land, education, neighbourhood activism, whiteness, race, practice, and here we're chatting about COP26. And I think the sort of main takeaway, what I've kind of learned from the past 2 weeks, is kind of how all the structures and instruments that we use to organise our lives are very blunt, and to try and really attenuate that with regards to when that comes into contact with people, neighborhoods, methods of organizing. And I think the kind of pluralization of, first of all, people, but also methods and ways of doing things is so critical to respond more nimbly to different contexts, geographies, environments. So I think really it's trying to build that from the grassroots to really influence the macro structures of things, for them to be far more articulated and responsive to wherever they come into contact with more localized environments. And, you know, taking the fringe as a geographical concept as well. I was already aware of this being based up in Scotland, but I think, you know, again, the centralization of many narratives and geographies and the kind of lack of interest sometimes from the centre, wherever that gravity point may be in relation to your own vicinity, but the lack of interest from the centre in the fringes, I think is also an issue. And I think what I'm really going to look forward to in my own work in the next little while is to really develop those collaborations and amplify collaborations and the methods of working which is found on the fringes, which I think sometimes the centre definitively ignores, but could certainly learn from. But I'll pass to my colleague Liana.
Yes, hello. If I just briefly come back to this event in particular, I think what stands out for me, and that is actually across all of the themes to be explored as part of this Architecture Fringe and this year's provocation of unlearning, is the interconnectedness of things and the interconnectedness of like climate change, for example, with economics, justice, health, but also whiteness and capitalism. And I really think that the discourse needs to be expanded beyond the built environment. I think we need to get in as many people as we possibly can. I think today's event was a good start. I think it can be stretched further. I think what we really also need in terms of climate change, I think, is a dialogue between the northern and the southern hemispheres. The south being disproportionately affected by it, mainly caused by our economic systems and our lifestyles. And when I say dialogue, I don't really mean kindness and charity and assertions of allyship from the north to the south. What I mean is like collective, effective coalition building between the nations, because we are all in this together really, and we will all feel the impacts of that. And I think we need to learn to work together on an even level, without the West or the North or the Northwest pretending that we know everything. And I think today's some of the presentations today showed really well what can be learned from other cultures and nations and approaches. I think personally, I feel that this theme of unlearning or the provocation of unlearning, I think we really only scratched the surface. It kind of feels like we kind of like started exploring it and now the fringe is finished. But it's not really finished. What we have learned as a fringe, I think, which was always an ambition for us, but this year is the first year where we actually managed to kind of turn things around in that area, is that most of the projects will continue in some way or form. It's more research rather than like a finite point for all of those projects. This one here is a good example with it continuing on to November and beyond. Many of our other projects continue and will continue. We will have a little mini series of events in autumn, picking up on many of the issues that we have explored this as part of the last 2 weeks. And then very personally to myself, I thought what Harsha said about like their relationship between like learning and unlearning is really interesting. When I first entered the profession as a female, I was totally aware that it's still a very male-dominated environment. So my way of approaching that was that I just had to be better than everybody else. I had to be double as good to make sure that when I go on site, people will recognize my expertise and my knowledge and take me serious. So I was working really hard to know as much as I can about everything, from design to technical standards to how you build things and whatever. And now it feels like really liberating now to be able to add like a layer of unlearning to that, because I'm totally in that kind of structure of I feel kind of like male dominated knowledge, and now that can be expanded. So that is my conclusion of all of the last year actually that we have been in that journey of starting to unlearn. And I just pass over to Neil. Oh, you're muted, Neil.
Thanks, Liana. Hello. Yeah, I suppose, first of all, would just say like a big thank you to all of the contributors, and I'll sort of come back to that at the end, just in terms of, I guess, reflecting on the theme of unlearning. I think it's sort of abundantly apparent for us that this is sort of an ongoing project, very much something that we're just kind of starting, and I think will feed into, you know, whatever the future themes of the architecture fringe might be. I think this will still be running underneath all of that as a kind of, I guess, an area of focus. I mean, I think just to be brief, I suppose the thing that I kind of took away from this program is just the opportunity of just feeling incredibly grateful for the opportunity to see into all of these amazing kind of projects that we've had people speak about or show us work from all over the world, from India to Detroit to Palestine. And I suppose I was having a conversation with a friend the other day, sort of, and we were just talking about stuff that wasn't really related to this, but we're trying to sort of decide how you know when something's worth it. And I think in the field of sort of activism, which a lot of this work might fall within, it's sometimes easy to feel like work is thankless and is unending, and it's difficult sometimes to kind of see the results. But I think for me, like the Unlearning Festival is kind of, or the Unlearning theme has kind of given us a kind of chance to see that even though things might be happening in isolation or in different parts of the world, if we kind of join them up, that's a really like incredibly powerful thing, and a really incredibly energizing thing as well, in terms of feeling like we have some agency in this and we have the ability to kind of change things. So far less in terms of sort of numbers or number of people, it's much more to do with the conversations that are being had. So on our unlearning journey, which will continue, I think those things are going to be something that kind of really stays with me anyway, and I'm really grateful for everyone who's contributed to the program to make it so rich and diverse in terms of the different projects and voices that we've heard from. So on that note, also I'm sanding floors in a flat today, hence why I'm on a phone and I look like a complete mess, but anyway, thank you for bearing with me.
Thank you all very much. And before we close, I'll pass to Matt as well. So what are your kind of closing thoughts on this event and reflections on the festival? And then we'll wrap up in full.
Thank you, Scott. And I would also like to thank everyone for today and all the contributors throughout the festival, both for the core and open program. I think today's discussion was very intriguing in so many levels. Basically, I think both the architecture fringe and the COP26 are like triggering points for all of us to reflect in ourselves and how we can do better, basically. And these occasions basically pave the path for all of us to move forward and try to do the better we can to actually make an impact and a change. I think all the discussion we had today and all the presentations gave to every one of us something to think, and I think that's the most important thing. And because I suppose for everyone this year was very, very difficult with COVID, and I think this reflected how the existing and emerging issues, both socially and environmentally, how the urgency for all these issues might, catch us unprepared, just like COVID did. And I think this is the time, and better now than later, to learn how to unlearn.
Oh, fantastic. So kind of personally, this event has been the first I've ever developed for the Fringe, because I was invited onto the core team this year. It's been an absolute delight. As a kind of climate justice activist in the built environment, I've spent 2 years, 4 or 5 years feeling like I'm screaming into a void. But this year, after this event especially, it's the complete inverse. So one of my favorite phrases I learned before the pandemic hit last year was, the antithesis of disaster capitalism. So what we're kind of looking at is disaster collectivism. So it's that mutual aid, that imagination, that looking at things differently. And the whole theme of unlearning in the festival has been really kind of trialed. This event, I've kind of really let it go. And it's been lovely to have collectives represented and for people to kind of self-select in voices, for to not prescribe, to let people decide. And the best thing that happened was this. This was the absolute best outcome this event could be. And a huge thank you to all of our speakers. You were absolutely incredible. I'm definitely recommending this to everyone to watch that I know. And thank you to the Fringe as well for the opportunity to have this as a closing event and to look towards COP26. Because with the climate crisis, it is entirely at its core, it's intersectional. It's not just carbon and targets and political empty promises. It's about something that's impacting every single life, human and non, on this planet. And to have such a hopeful event as a finisher to the Fringe, that's not about finishing, it's about looking forwards, has been absolutely incredible. So thank you very, very much, everyone, for your contributions. Thank you, everyone, for your time and watching this. And a huge thanks to the Fringe for putting on such an incredible festival as well. So that is all from us. And thank you very, very much.
And the final note, please follow us on our social media. We are almost everywhere, so yeah, please follow us there. And we, if you could also support us on Patreon, this would be really, really helpful for us. Every contribution, even the smallest one, is very, very useful for us. And thanks again for everything. Thank you, Scott, for organizing this. And of course, the Architecture Fringe, and also all the people that are behind the scenes, and our digital producer as well for today. So yeah, thank you. Thank you again for everything.